All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our 23-24 gallery season of Artist Talks. Today, I'm joined by Jared, who currently has his exhibition Geologic Confluence on display in our Kader Gallery through January 6th. So welcome, Jared, and thank you for joining me.
Thanks very much for having me, Olivia.
Yes, and why don't we begin with you giving us a little bit of background of your journey in the art world?
I am an assistant professor of art teaching ceramics at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. Um, I was really born into clay. Um, Born outside of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. My dad taught high school ceramics. This is fig, by the way. Um, he taught high school ceramics for 30 years. My mom was an elementary school teacher. So I was exposed to clay and art very early on. It's something I've just kind of always done. Even though I went to undergrad at UW-Madison originally for engineering. And then I've lived all throughout the country. I moved out of Wisconsin for 12 years. I was in Charlotte, North Carolina for 2 years. I went to grad school at Kansas State University in Manhattan, Kansas. And then before I came to UWL, I was teaching ceramics at a community college in San Luis Obispo, California.
Wonderful. And once you got back into ceramics after you went to UW-Madison, what inspired you to get back into the realm of teaching and sculpture and things like that?
Yeah, well, I, you know, while I was at Madison in engineering, I was still taking ceramics classes just because I really enjoyed it. And when I was there, I just really was not loving my math and science classes like I was in high school. I had really amazing teachers in high school. Um, and so I ended up switching my major to art. But then I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do with that art degree. I mean, my goal was ultimately to be a ceramics professor, but I knew I wasn't quite ready for grad school. So I did a program called Teach for America, where I actually taught high school geometry and algebra in North Carolina, in Charlotte. But then while I was there teaching high school math, I also was working with the art teacher there. We founded an art club. I was teaching a pottery class at a local ceramic studio. And I just knew that, like, ultimately my goal was to become a ceramics professor. So even though, ceramics hasn't been my sole career for my whole life, it has always been a part of my life.
Great. And as we get into your works a little bit, I know that you've discussed a little bit how your math past has influenced your work in ceramics. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that as we get into the inspiration for your show. So as we move into one of the first pieces that you have on display, would you mind talking a little bit about that inspiration for these ceramic pieces?
Yeah, so this show specifically and this like body of work is really inspired by the seasons growing up in Wisconsin and now being back here, as well as the local geology. So, looking out our back window of our house, I see the bluffs. And with this piece specifically, um, I see this like dripping white slip, and this piece specifically, I was thinking about on La Crescent, so on the Minnesota side, the bluffs, how over time it develops these like massive, massive icicles and almost like ice waterfalls from freezing and thawing and freezing and thawing, hence the name freeze thaw cycle. Um, I just think it's like so spectacularly beautiful seeing those. So yeah, this piece was wood fired, and I can talk a little bit about the process of wood firing. But I used a red stoneware, so there's a lot of iron in this stoneware. for the background, the main piece. And then I used a white slip that I developed to crack as it dried, that I just put on top of it and had it drip to allude to that effect of this like freezing and thawing and these icicles forming.
Could you describe what a slip is in ceramics?
Yeah, sorry, thank you. Yeah, so slip is just basically liquid clay. So everyone who's ever worked with clay, you can turn pretty much any clay into a slip just by adding more water and mixing it. And if you've ever thrown on the potter's wheel, it's like that clay that comes off in your hand as you're working, that is a slip.
Okay. And you described that you had it crack before the firing process. Um, could you describe a little bit about the firing process and if you used any glazes specifically in this piece?
Yeah, so this slip is designed to crack. I mean, you can kind of see that it's put on pretty thick. So it's designed to crack because of the shrinkage rate, and that shrinkage is different from the stoneware that's below it. And so all clay shrinks as it dries. If you think about that, it's just the moisture evaporating. And with that slip drying and shrinking at a different rate, then there's that pressure, and it's either going to pop off or it's going to crack to relieve that pressure. Um, so this piece, there's no glaze on that background form. It's kind of like this dark purple maroon uh, form with some yellows in there. And then the slip, I actually did brush on a glaze, like a blue glaze. But then I wiped it all away. So that glaze was only in the inside of those cracks. So there's really not much glaze on it. But in this process of wood firing, this piece was fired in the UWL wood kiln. And so what that means is we're achieving all of our heat, and we fire it up to 2,400 degrees. We're achieving all of that heat just with wood. And the way the kiln is designed, it's insulated so well that continuing to put in that wood achieves that temperature. So we fire that kiln for 40 straight hours. That means that there are people there for 40 hours overnight, everything. And one of the unique things about wood firing is it's called an atmospheric firing. And so it depends on where the piece is in the kiln. You're going to get slightly different effects. It's also self glazing. And so as the wood is burned, you think about like a chimney or a fire pit or something, you see all of that smoke and all of that ash fly up. Well, it flies through the kiln and it deposits itself onto the pieces. And then it gets so hot that it actually melts that wood ash and turns it into a glaze. So even though the white slip specifically doesn't have glaze on it, it's very, very shiny because it is glazed from that wood ash and that process.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for explaining that process.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very cool. And so here is another piece of yours, geologic timeline. This piece is much bigger than what we can actually see here on this screen. But could you describe a little bit of your process and inspiration with this work?
Yeah, a lot of my work, I really love this idea of press molding. And so it's building a plywood frame and taking clay and pressing it into there. On the previous slide, you can see some of like the natural kind of cracking and things that I'm achieving with that. Um, I like that rigidity and that like geometry um, of that having really geometric form with a very organic surface. And so with this, I am thinking about, I go out hiking in the bluffs, take our puppy on walks, my wife and I go out there, and I'm just so fascinated by the layers of it and the strata of that. And, geologists, everyone, or many people, I think, know that you see these layers, and the deeper down you go in that layering, you're essentially going back in time, um, using geology to do that. And so with this piece, I'm thinking specifically about that layering process. Um, to make this piece, uh, it's it's like 2.5 feet tall. It's pretty large. It's probably the biggest piece I've ever wood fired, and I'm really excited that it survived that process because it's such a hot and volatile process. But I used a red stoneware and a white stoneware, and I actually, to get the detail of that texture, I put some clay on the potter's wheel and didn't center it or anything with with it spinning. I then just took like a 2x4 or a piece of wood that had a sharp edge on it, and I just kind of scraped it on there and had that clay come up and accumulate. And then I would just peel that bit off, set it aside, and I just kept doing it. And then I took those pieces and put them in and layered them. Um, so I wish there was a little bit more, or you could tell a little bit better of the different, like the white versus the red stoneware. But if you look closely, I think you can see that.
Yeah, and definitely in person too, those
Yeah.
ridges and things pop a lot more. Um,
Mhm.
did you use the same kind of glazing idea as you did with the last one, of wiping some glazes and taking it off, or did you mainly rely on the wood firing process to get some of those colors?
Yeah, good question. This has no glaze on it, no glaze at all. So it was put into the wood kiln, just bisque fired. Bisque is that first firing, and that's it. So all of that is just the magic of the kiln doing its thing.
And when you start out a piece, do you have an idea of what form of firing you're going to use with it, or is it kind of all just part of the process?
Um, yeah, I mean, built my first soda fired kiln at Carroll University in Waukesha with the professor Mike Imes back in 2010, I think. And that was the first time that I had ever like really atmospheric fired. I guess I did wood fire once in undergrad. But I'm just so fascinated by that process of an atmosphere and like leaving the control, or letting loose of the control and just trusting the kiln and that process and the materials to do what they're going to do. I love the surprise of, then unloading and just seeing exactly what happened. And I mean, not everything turns out, a lot of things don't turn out, but specifically with wood and soda firing, I think that that surface really echoes rock and stone and the local geology. Um, so I also just really hate glazing. The process of glazing is probably my least favorite part of the ceramic process. I love making. And so I'm not saying that I'm trying to be lazy because these are very, very labor intensive firing processes. But I think a lot of glaze can just be very flat, like a little monotone, and just too glossy and too shiny. And it isn't as interesting to me as the volatility and surface variation that you can achieve in a wood or a soda fire.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that to us. Here is your next piece. I did also give a little bit of a close-up image as well for viewers to see some of that wonderful texture. Um, this is reduction fired stoneware. Could you explain a little bit about how that is a different firing process?
Definitely. So these are glazed. The slip area with all of that massive texture, I brushed on a glaze and then wiped it away. And then I sprayed a fake ash glaze. So ash glazes are designed to like melt a lot and kind of move. And so I fired these at a lower temperature. So if you used actual wood ash, it wouldn't melt. So it's a fake wood ash. So reduction fire, it just means that you're firing in a gas kiln potentially. You can fire in oxidation in a gas kiln. I really like, if I am going to glaze and fire my work, I really do enjoy the process of reduction firing because you can get some of that surface variation. Um, and so reduction firing is essentially just choking off some of the oxygen, removing that oxygen from the kiln. If you're firing in an electric kiln, which a lot of people do, a lot of schools have, it's always firing in oxidation. And that just means that there's always enough oxygen in that kiln, and that's going to affect the colors of a glaze differently than reduction. Reduction, you're using a flame, gas generally. And so, in order for fire to burn, it needs a fuel source and it needs oxygen. And so, you can control the amount of oxygen that's in that kiln by the amount of gas that you're supplying it. If you put in more gas than is able to be consumed, then it's going to be in reduction. You can also use the damper, which is just like almost a kiln shelf on the chimney on the exit flue to control how much of that pressure is in there. And that flame and that excess gas is going to create carbon monoxide, which wants to be stable. It's a really unstable molecule, so it wants to turn into carbon dioxide. And it's searching out, finding that oxygen from the clay body and from the glaze, and it's actually pulling that oxygen out of there, changing the colors of some of the glazes. The easiest way to explain that is like copper. Think of copper. Um, the color of the Statue of Liberty, we all know, is green. That's because that copper has been oxidized. So a copper glaze fired in an electric kiln is going to be green. But then if you have that same copper glaze and fire it in reduction, it'll turn red, similar to like a fresh copper penny.
All right, great. And could you describe a little bit the building process of these pieces? Were these also pressed onto plywood, like you mentioned before? Or could you discuss a little the hand building process of creating these larger ceramic pieces?
Yeah, definitely. These are, I think, about 2.5 feet. They're pretty big, and just major props to you, Olivia and Scott, for hanging these. You guys did such a good job with them. Yeah, so I built just a plywood form and I line it with newspaper and crumpled newspaper. You can see some of the texture where there isn't slip. That's just folds in the newspaper. And I'm taking clay and I'm pressing it into that mold. Um, they're all hollow. They're built hollow because otherwise they would weigh a lot and have a lot higher chance of exploding from moisture. But I'm building them hollow, pressing that in, letting them sit for a couple hours, and then flipping them over and kind of taking the mold off, almost like a Jello mold or something. And because of that newspaper in there, it doesn't stick. It's able to come off pretty easily. Um, and then I let them dry as forms, so they become bone dry over probably a week of slow drying. And then I take that crackle slip, mix it up, and just goop a lot of it on there. And if you look on some of those, like the close up image, the image on the right, you can kind of see this like wave in it. That's because I took a rib, which is just a plastic tool that has serrations in it, and I just did this movement through that. So even though the cracking is somewhat random, if you do put some of those rib marks, you can kind of control how some of the cracking is going to happen. And with that, you know, I think of this, even though it looks like cracked earth, it really reminds me of snow. Growing up skiing a lot, I love skiing. But I was just like thinking about freshly groomed ski slopes and how you have those little ridges and everything. So that's kind of what I was playing with putting some of that into the slip.
Yeah, and highly recommend coming to view these works in person. They're very impressive, hanging on the wall, and also depending on which angle you look at them, you can get different shadows as well. They're really wonderful. So I highly recommend coming in person to see these as well. And all right, here is the last piece in your exhibition that we're discussing today, Ancient Strata. Could you talk a little bit about this piece?
Yeah, so again, I'm thinking about that like stratification of the stone, the local geology. So this is also press molded. Um, I don't know. Some of my best ideas, I'm sure other people can think of this, but this idea came to me at night laying in bed, and I had it in my head, and I really just needed to make this. Um, and so this is press molded in a similar form, that same form that I made on that first horizontal piece that we talked about. But I really wanted to play up those layers and thinking about a lot of those rocks in the bluffs, they're formed in these layers, and some of them will pop out, some are kind of loose and you can pull out. And so you really do get some of that depth, not just a stacking, but some will go back, some will stick out. So I took a lot of just little scrap pieces of wood and I just stacked them, put them into this mold, put my newspaper on top, and then I was pressing in that clay. And then with this piece, there's white stoneware, red stoneware, and porcelain. You can kind of see in the detail shot that you have some of that gray, and that gray spot is actually porcelain. This was fired on its side in the wood kiln, and I was just so happy that it survived the firing. Um, yeah, I mean, I could see this thing as like being an ancient artifact that was unearthed by someone or by future humans, or again, just like an actual geologic study looking at these layers and kind of counting the years or figuring out what happened. Maybe it was, an ancient volcano that erupted and deposited this layer of ash on a certain timeline. Um, so those are the things that I'm thinking about when I'm making these pieces.
Yeah, wonderful. Do you choose what type of clay you're going to use, mostly based on color, or um, is there other differences between the types of stoneware or porcelain that help you decide which you're going to use in a certain piece?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think about the color. Um, Also, I just think about like what I'm making. Porcelain is generally not great for hand building, in part because it shrinks a lot. There's not a lot of large particles. Whereas stoneware, you can mix in grog, which is essentially just sand, and that isn't going to shrink. So stoneware shrinks a lot less. Anytime something is shrinking, there's stress being put on it. So that's why most of these pieces I'm making with stoneware and just portions of it are porcelain. I actually wasn't sure if this was going to work having porcelain pushed in there with the stoneware around it because they shrink at different rates. They shrink a different percentage. Um, but I am also thinking about the color. A lot of I have a lot of functional work in the show as well, teapots and cups, and pretty much all of those are made out of porcelain. And so you can get really beautiful whites, and I wedged in some iron into that porcelain to break up that white surface. But the stoneware, I am thinking about getting some of those like iron rich, deep red colors. You can get, depending on where it is in the kiln and the amount of ash that's hitting it, you can get greens, yellows, browns, oranges. Um, so I'm kind of trying to consider all of that, but a lot of these are also just experimentation. a lot of larger experiments and tests that I want to do.
Yeah, wonderful. All right. And speaking of, I did include one photo of one of the teapots that is on display. These are really wonderful. There are lots of cups and things as well. You're free to buy them and take them with you, unlike some of our other exhibition pieces where they have to stay on display until the end. So highly recommend coming and seeing this work in person. It's really wonderful to see all of the different colors and textures and shapes in this ceramic show. We haven't really had a full ceramic installation at the pump house before, so this is definitely new for us and very exciting. So everyone, you have until January 6th to come and see Jared's work. Jared, is there anything that you would like people to keep in mind when viewing your work in person?
I mean, kind of what you had mentioned, step back from it, get a sort of larger view, but then get close to it, investigate some of those textures, some of those surfaces, and just move around it. The functional work is meant to be used. So if you're interested in buying a cup, pick it up. Um, Make sure it fits your hand well. They're all food safe, dishwasher safe, and microwave safe. I use all custom handmade ceramic work. And then if you have any questions about the work or want to get in contact with me, I'd love to talk to you about it. You can find me on Instagram, which is just at my name, at Jared Pfeiffer, or my email. I'm listed on the UWL website, obviously. And I am selling some work at an upcoming artisan sale Sunday, December 3rd at 608 Brewing Company from 1 to 5. So if you want to meet me, I'll be there as well.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Olivia. And again, I really appreciate all the work that you and Scott did, as well as the installation team. And thank you to the Pump House and Allison and everyone else.
Thank you.